From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. My co-host is David Feldman, and the man of the hour is Ralph Nader. We have an excellent show for you today. Later in the program, we're going to be speaking to a whistleblower in the medical profession, Dr. Helene Z. Hill from Rutgers University, who's going to talk to us about how we need to establish a better system for reporting and adjudicating alleged scientific fraud. But first, David, tell us about our first guest, who in fact is our first repeat guest on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
That's right. We had Bill Curry on back in November to help analyze the results of the midterm elections, which, as you may recall, was a debacle for the Democratic Party. Mr. Curry has been an elected comptroller for the state of Connecticut. He was also a two-time Democratic nominee for governor of Connecticut, as well as White House counselor during the Bill Clinton administration. He is a political columnist for Salon, where his latest article is entitled, "Hillary Clinton Just Doesn't Get It. She's Already Running a Losing Campaign." Welcome back, Bill Curry.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
And before we get started, gentlemen, I want to play a clip from Hillary Clinton's announcement for president, which she posted on social media a few days ago. It begins with ordinary Americans talking about their lives and dreams and what they hope to do. And then at the minute and a half mark, Senator Clinton finally makes her entrance and says,
"I'm getting ready to do something too. I'm running for president." Americans have fought their way back from tough economic times, but the deck is still stacked in favor of those at the top. Everyday Americans need a champion, and I want to be that champion. So you can do more than just get by. You can get ahead and stay ahead, because when families are strong, America is strong. So I'm hitting the road to earn your vote, because it's your time, and I hope you'll join me on this journey.
Ralph, Bill, what say you?
Well, Bill, I think the audience should know that you have been a firm Democrat all your life. Your parents are Democrat. You've once said that you don't know how to turn our country around unless we turn the Democratic Party around. But you've also emerged as a fresh, incisive critic of the Democratic Party. And just last Sunday, you've created quite a stir with your weekly column on Salon titled, "Hillary Clinton Just Doesn't Get It. She's Already Running a Losing Campaign," end quote. What do you mean by that?
Well, one, it's great to be talking to you, Ralph. I want to say, first of all, actually, the only misleading thing about that headline, which wasn't actually a quote from me, is the part where she's already running a losing campaign. And one of the points I have to make is I don't know whether it's a losing campaign or not. Democrats, every 2 years of late, come up with the ingenious strategy of just hoping that Republicans will defeat themselves. And sometimes it works. You know, it's the law of averages would say it must. The Republicans may do just what these Democrats are all hoping, nominate someone so insane and so unacceptable that it won't matter what kind of campaign we run. And it's all in the future. But there are bigger problems apart from handicapping the race. And they fall into three categories. And interrupt me at any point, but the first one is simply the regular tactical stuff people talk about. Is this an effective campaign? To me, watching her for the last year, she's been like Boo Radley not coming out of the house. It created a vacuum in which, in fact, her few missteps just looked significant on the email, and some other smaller cosmetic ones looked even worse than they were. She dropped 20 points in favorability. Her apologists say that was inevitable. I say that's not a good way to think, and I don't think it's true, and I think it's a dangerous way of thinking about it. What she did now, this announcement on Sunday, if you think about it, it was of a piece with the last year. She didn't even show up for her own announcement. She barely showed up for the announcement video. We've all seen those kinds of videos in campaigns where, you know, the man in the street, different men and women get on and say, you know, if it weren't for Congressman Sludge Pump, I never would have gotten my Social Security benefit. Please help him. Or the day the water turned brown in our community, we all knew something was wrong. These people weren't even talking about politics, never mind Hillary or government. They weren't even issues. I'm getting ready to plant a garden, one woman said. To go to school, a child said. I've never seen that. It's worth pausing to think about whether she can do it this way. This social media all the rage. The idea that social media was going to help create democratic movements and create more democracy. It's really the place where the politically undead hang out. It's where a Sarah Palin or a Donald Trump can pretend to be in politics by saying something mean and then not having to take any questions. In cyberspace, nobody can hear your question. And so the way this is being handled so far, it just makes me think that it isn't going to be any different and that she's not going to go out and debate these issues the way she has to.
You made the point that announcing is a great opportunity for any candidate, even a prominent one.
You only get 2 or 3 chances. Even a presidential candidate, it's actually amazing how seldom, unless you have like a Reverend Wright scandal or problem and you have to get up and the whole nation's watching, you basically get your announcement. You get the night you win your first primary, you get the convention. And then if you make it that far, you get presidential debates. And there won't be another night like this, even if she now has a formal announcement in a month, which she's scrambling to put together now. She gave up an enormous chance to make her case to the American people. She won't get many. And so I think there's an opportunity cost. Whether you think, I thought the van thing was just so strange. You know, and in that video, she talks about everyday Americans, which is a phrase I'm not really comfortable with. But, you know, I feel like I can kind of speak for them. And we don't drive 1,000 miles to Iowa, actually, unless it's a camping trip or we just embezzled and the law is chasing us. To get there, I saw her at that Chipotle. You couldn't tell if she was placing an order or telling the guy to empty the cash register. It just, this is not normal.
But now, she's supposed to be an experienced candidate. They keep saying that's one of her big pluses. She has the advice of Bill Clinton, who's supposed to be a master politician. She's been consulting with dozens and dozens of people in the past 7 to 10 months. How could she come out with almost like a wimpy beginning and even have Senator Rubio get more ink in the papers than she got because she didn't offer him anything to write about?
Let me just say that I agree with all that, but it goes to the second point. I said there were 3 points. The second point is the state of politics today, where the basic business model is you go to the wealthiest people you know, all the moneyed interests, and you crook the knee for as much money as you can get, thus mortgaging yourself to the status quo and to the past. And then you go out and you hire all these expensive celebrity consultants and pollsters, and they tell you how to have the right message. And they give you this George Lakoff, Drew Weston line about how people don't really think logically or rationally about politics. They use the reptilian part of their brain. They only need metaphors, and they need their emotions manipulated. You have to tell them nice stories. And the problem is that this is the perfect strategy for Republicans who want to do lots of things that aren't good for people and that people don't actually like in the specific, who want to keep politics metaphorical and thematic and abstract. But if you're the party of change, if you're supposed to be the party of change, you have to be the party that puts a blueprint to the vision. People don't choose change with the reptilian part of their brain. They choose change when they're called to something higher. That's what a real progressive has to do. And so you have to shake free of this money and of the techniques that they're using. We need a presidential candidate out on the Chautauqua circuit, mixing it up with real everyday people, not in little staged events, the morsels of which are spoon-fed to reporters who've been embedded with the campaign. We need a real live American democracy. If this party, this Democratic Party in which I have grown up and given my life, is going to just circle the wagons and ask everybody to quietly get in line, how will people even know it exists for the next 19 months?
They've leaked that she's going to raise $2.5 billion. I never heard a figure like that. $1 billion, I've heard. But in your article on Salon, you say, quote, if she raises all that money, it will ruin her, end quote. What do you mean?
If that's really the plan, and again, I don't have any reason to think it isn't the plan, then in fact, in and of itself, it will. I'll just give you a small example at a much smaller scale, which is the Clinton reelect. I was in the Clinton White House and very much involved in that 1996. And throughout that year, 2 years, people know now who remember this stuff, all the map room teas, the constant fundraising, the Lincoln bedroom sleepovers. He paid such a price for it. The more the public saw of it, the less they liked it. All the money was spent on ads that Clinton himself, and I know he's got a greater political mind I'm certain than I'll ever have, but he was persuaded that all those ads he bought with that money really helped him. I would say 2 things. One, Because of those financial scandals at the end and his inability to respond to them, he lost half his margin. We'd led by 15 points per month for almost a year. It was cut in half. He never got a congressional majority. He never got a mandate. His second term was listless, without a compass really from the beginning. Because of the Lewinsky thing, people never really focused on it. That became his second term. But he was already in trouble. Because of the kind of fundraising he did, because of the commitments you make, because of how it looked to people and how they start to feel about you. The second biggest complaint is that it really doesn't work. Clinton's ads didn't reelect him. Clinton started to come back at the Oklahoma City bombing, and the country liked how he handled it. And that was his first bump. And when Gingrich closed the government down and Clinton acted like an adult, that was his second bump. The consultants and the pollsters and the Washington pundits are so invested, literally, in telling you that it's the money you raise and spend through them that matters rather than what you do. And it's not true. People are, as much as they want to avert their gaze from the democracy, they know enough about what you're actually doing. If you can come back with some real solid achievements, in fact, count on them. They're smart enough and good hard enough to reelect you.
These consultants, you say, make most of their money where? These political consultants to Democrats.
In the Democratic Party, all of the top consultants, not a figure of speech, all of the top consultants. I won't go through the list. There may be one single exception, but all of them make most of their money from corporate clients. If they were a real profession, it would be a conflict of interest. To go into a candidate who's supposed to be standing up, especially for working people, for consumers, for the poor, the dispossessed, the marginal, and the excluded, to be making all his or her money from the most powerful corporations or the substantial majority of it. And if you're a lawyer, you can't take two clients with such conflicting interests. You're not supposed to. Even that's fading in the other professions. But if we still had professional standards, you wouldn't do it.
How do they worm their way into the campaign then?
Well, it's a very, they start out by winning a couple of races. And then as soon as they win a couple of races, they start looking for corporate work. And that builds up. And their celebrity reputations, they're not known. You've never heard of a Democratic consultant who was known for coming up with good policy ideas. It's two different things. So they're known for how nice their ads are. David Axelrod was actually the consigliere to Obama, went out and talked about this just before Obama ran the first time, that he believed in the politics of biography. As Axelrod said that, and from his work clearly really believes, Democrats, he felt, were too involved in issues. And that was their mistake, because issues divide people, and that all of his work was to sell people's life stories. And look, it worked, and it worked incredibly well for the president himself. I would say that it's going to work less well every single election. After Obama, the next person who just says, yes, we can, and doesn't tell you how, is going to have a steeper road, a harder road, because people want to know, and people are more desperate. The middle class is smaller, poorer, and less secure, and people's anxiety rises up every day. And Abraham Lincoln told us in different words, you can't just keep running the same old hustle and think you can fool everybody.
And why do the Democrats got this mantra? They always refer to the middle class, which is, you say, shrinking. They never refer to the poor, which is growing, or lower income people. It's all middle class.
Because the consultants tell you that no one wants to hear about the poor. So presidents give long speeches. You can count the State of the Union speeches in which Democratic presidents don't mention cities. Clinton didn't mention the word city till his seventh State of the Union speech.
Isn't that where the votes who stay home are? Don't they want to appeal to the votes of poor people?
Let me just say, one, I agree. Two, I'm fine with talking about the middle class, so long as you're really talking about how more people can get into it and how more people can stay into it. One of the stories of the last 40 years is that America moved from blue-collar industrial to blue-collar service jobs and thus exited the middle class by the wrong door. And it's one thing, the problem with the Democrats' quote-unquote middle-class populism is that it ends up just being a pander to the middle class. If the discussion here is how to broaden and strengthen the middle class, and the remedies are really going to move in that direction, you've got real plans to do it, fine by me. I do think at the same time that what you said is right, that if you're a leader in public life in any country, you have a duty not to encourage the whole nation to be an amnesiac, not to encourage denial about the people who are in the most need, not to allow inaccurate myths to grow up, Every Democrat, as much as Republicans, talks about waste, fraud, and abuse in government, encouraging the idea that most of this money is being squandered. By the way, if they just picked fraud, if they just talked about corruption, they'd have a real case to make. But they don't want to do that. And the biggest loss for government is through corruption. Anthony Kennedy calls it soft corruption, but it's the influence of moneyed interest over the government, their ability to get their way at everyone else's expense. That's a real issue. But when you just get up and talk about waste, fraud, and abuse and helping the middle class, everybody knows that it translates in a subtext you can just about read into the government does too much for the poor, but now we're going to do more for you.
In your article, you say, quote, Republicans love to paint Democrats as elitists. It's how the first two Bushes took out Dukakis, Gore, and Kerry, and how Jeb Bush plans to take out Hillary, end quote. What's going on here?
Well, a lot of people wrote, among the many people who disagreed with my column, I heard from a number who said, how can you possibly say the Bushes, those awful, rich, entitled Bushes, can paint anybody else as an elitist? And my answer to which is yes, it does seem counterintuitive, and all the more blame on us for letting them get away with it. But that's what the Bushes do for a living, and sometimes we help them. John Kerry, it seemed as if he'd spent his life cultivating the very privileged accent the Bushes spent their lives trying to shed. All the Bushes went to Harvard and then to Texas in order to look like something else. And it worked pretty darn well for them. There is no more entitled, privileged family in America than the Bushes, but they do a pretty good job of imitating, of looking and sounding like everyday Americans.
You say that Bill and Hillary set it up for them. When Hillary said she and Bill were broke when they left the White House, and how else did they set it up for them?
Again, I
to
think
be called elitists.
I didn't say Bill set up for him. Bill's as good as any Democrat in my lifetime at looking and sounding like an ordinary person. And in many ways, in a psychological, cultural ways, he actually has kept his roots. It's what you do. It's what you're for. It's how you're approaching politics. Forget their personalities. And I think every time a Marco Rubio or a Rand Paul attacks them viciously, it costs the Republicans vote. She should be so lucky as to have her opponents keep it on that plane. There's something deeper here. America looks at this generation of leaders, at its failed meritocracy. Jefferson dreamed of a meritocracy in which the best would rise and give back to their communities. Something's gone wrong here. Our best and brightest go to Wall Street and take more than they give. And the people who have run this economic consensus of, the Tom Friedman who calls globalization the golden straitjacket. Straitjacket because you can't do anything about it. You can't resist it. It's got you. But golden because, hey, don't worry. Everything's going to work out for everybody. And everybody who really is an everyday American looks out and they realize that a rising tide no longer lifts all boats. It doesn't even lift most boats. It hardly lifts any boats at all. And that means that you need something more than a stimulus or a jump start. And I think Obama's and now Clinton's greatest mistake is treating the economy as something that can be cured by more growth. We have fundamental structural disorder here. It's time for someone, instead of pledging allegiance to the market every day and leaving it at that, it's time for a Democrat to say, you know what? I just noticed that the job creators, they don't actually create any jobs. That information technology may be the first technological revolution that doesn't create more jobs. That globalization is, in fact, if we just let it do what it wants, working against us. And I understand that everybody who's little's in trouble. As small businesses, people get all the lip service and none of the actual service. We had 12,000 banks 10 years ago. We have 6,000 now. And it's all the little ones that are dying while the Goldman Sachs people grow fatter and fatter by the hour. Somebody has to stand up and say, I get it. I know this isn't working. I know we have to do something fundamentally different in order to create the kind of political economy we all want to live in. All I want is a Democratic candidate or a candidate for president. I know I'm talking to one who did it, but all I'm looking for now is for somebody to get up and do that.
Bill, let's get down to the nitty-gritty in terms. How is Hillary going to handle the issues of globalization, exporting jobs, outsourcing industries, the trade agreements that have worked against U.S. workers and U.S. sovereignty, and the coming one, Trans-Pacific? How's she going to deal with empire? How's she going to deal with her speech at Annapolis Naval Academy, which Secretary of State focusing on the pivot to East Asia, which China views as a threat and has mobilized even more military budget for China. How is she going to deal with minimum wage? How is she going to deal with the Walmarts? How is she going to deal with Wall Street, which isn't taxed in its transactions? How can she avoid all this if her main support is going to be the labor unions? It's going to be supposedly people who believe in the social safety net. If she doesn't have competition in the primary, how do you view anybody coming into the primary, including the four names that are mentioned, that can really bring the Democratic primary down to grips on the real issues of the maldistribution of power, wealth, and income?
Well, first of all, when I talk to people about this, I actually quote a conversation you and I had a long time ago, but in how hard it's become in any venue in America to have a substantive discussion. When you were starting out, the networks would cover a hearing at the Senate, and they'd lead the news. The three networks had most Americans all among them watching, and they'd lead the news in a discussion. What does the Clinton campaign spend the first 2 days doing? Tweeting, 140 characters. It's half the length of a 30-second ad, which I thought we'd all agreed we hated, you know? And so it's very difficult, not just in this campaign, but in any kind of campaign and electoral politics right now, to have that kind of discussion. My biggest answer, let me say, to all these questions is I don't know. I look at the field. I can't quite judge. I listen to Martin O'Malley. It sounds to me like he's auditioning to be her vice president. He seems extremely reluctant to draw sharp distinctions or to ask precise policy questions. This debate has to be concrete, specific, evidence-based, the debate we need. It has to be empirical, and it has to be brave. Warren can't seem to make up her mind. She seems, and I'm just trying to be a psychologist, she seems increasingly dissatisfied with Clinton as candidate, but no more inclined toward running. I don't know if any of the people will even make the race. When you're the underdog, you also have to be the early bird. That Clinton beat all her purported Democratic challengers to an announcement of any kind suggests to me that there may not be this kind of debate that you're asking about. And so then the question becomes, how do progressives, to me, because that's the only debate worth talking about. You know, it's important to beat the Republicans in their debate, but that's not a debate about anything important. They don't even think global warming exists. They're just drenched in ideology and denial. Somewhere there has to be a discussion about how we make the democracy more ethical, about how we raise wages and make investment capital available to the local farmers and to the really small businesses that are trying to get up. This big corporate state, it's like an invasive species that's devouring all the diversity, the biodiversity of our pond, and somebody has to get up and stop it. It's a different interview, but there are lots of things you can do. But the first question is, where do we even have the discussion? I think that the discussion has to begin among progressive institutions, the MoveOns, 350.org, the Dean organization, all of the network that you put in place of the PERGs and the various citizen action, and also your own policy network. There is this large progressive movement struggling to be born. And whether it was the consumer movement, the women's movement, the civil rights, peace movements, every progressive social change movement since the Civil War, they've all been the engines of all of our progress. They were all independent. They were all nonpartisan. I happen to be the political director of one of the last, the Nuclear Freeze movement. We had a blueprint, verifiable bilateral agreements to stop the research, development, production, deployment of nuclear weapons. The public went from 20% to 80% supporting it in about 2 years. And 4 years later, Ronald Reagan went to Reykjavik and tried to cashier the whole system. What we don't have now, after 20 years of Wall Street colonizing the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party in turn colonizing the left, what we don't have is a progressive social change movement with a clear agenda and a bottom line. And that's what it will take. Not just finding some candidate to run against Hillary. This is a much bigger task. And if we do it, we can accomplish something great. I'll just finish by saying that I've been telling people lately that all politicians are chameleons. And every 2 years, we waste all of our time trying to pick the right chameleon, when in fact, the only way to change any chameleon is to change the background, the context. What's changed in America is the context. We no longer have the kind of independent political movements that have been the engine of all of our change for 150 years. And the question here, at what we pray is the end of the age of Reagan, is how to get them back.
What's the trend in the next year is just the opposite. The press is now 90% talking about the personalities of the candidates' tactics, how they relate to one another. Is Senator Rubio upsetting Jeb Bush, who brought him into politics? And just today, or in the New York Times, rather, they had a front page article on the wife of Rand Paul and how she's trying to soften his sharp barbs and image. How do you caricature something like that?
I just want to say this, Ralph, okay? Trying my hardest to wind up on an inspiring note, you would bring up what's actually happening. Yes, it's true.
A lot of change happens with the evocation of public distaste, like, yuck. Come on, you guys, get serious. Stop, stop blowing up the world in our name. Stop kneeling before Wall Street in our name. We're supposed to be the genesis of your power. And then people are going to say, why are we giving all these politicians our power?
I agree. I can't tell you how much negative blowback I've gotten from a lot of my old party friends about criticizing Hillary Clinton and doing it specifically and concretely. And it's, as you know, it's not because I don't like her or respect her. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, consistent with what both of us have just said, I look at the first few years of the Obama administration, to a large degree right up to this moment, all the progressives who would not say a word in criticism. And I believe in my heart, I wrote and believed then, that the bailout was a terrible idea, the stimulus was not a good idea, and not a good stimulus and not a sufficient idea anyway, because it isn't just about the business cycle. And I believe that if there had been no bailout and been no stimulus, there'd be no Tea Party. There'd be no Republican majority. If instead Obama had simply kept his promise to do a robust public option to bring down healthcare prices down, really bring them down for small business, self-employed, if he'd raised the minimum wage when he had the votes, if he'd bailed out the homeowners hurt in 2008, which he said was a sacred promise, if he'd kept the ethics promises. Yes, Hillary talked about the people at the top getting everything, and people compared it to Elizabeth Warren. It's what the Tea Party's been peddling, crony capitalism. They only see crony capitalism when a Democrat gets a government contract. But they're right to complain about it. And everybody, all the candidates, every announcement had that in it. We have to show that we're really willing to put an end to this degradation of government.
A couple of things quickly, Bill. Mention what Hillary's going to do next week at the Global Women's Summit, and then give me a few examples of taboos, subjects that aren't going to be discussed in the presidential campaign by the agreement of both parties, however unconscious.
First of all, apart from the Middle East, and we'll come back to it in a second, there aren't any that are taboo that won't come up as a theme. There'll be a phrase for every one of them, but they're all taboo if you mean a real debate. The fundamental debate here, expressed in the broadest terms, is simply this. Okay, we get how even Democratic and Republican presidents alike have approached free trade and globalization, information technology, but it was all going to redound to our universal benefit, improvement of our lives. Has it? And if not, why not? And what will you do to change the course of it rather than just lie down? One simple argument to make is to help people understand, instead of just constantly praising the current operation of markets, to get up and say, listen, markets are really good at creating wealth, but they're terrible at distributing it. The only reason we have a middle class is that the government came out and fought for a minimum wage and a 40-hour week, child labor laws, Social Security, Medicare, GI Bill. You rip all that out tomorrow, and the middle class, even the biggest middle class in the world, simply folds instantly. What's wrong with these trade agreements is that they're sending all of our jobs, all of our industry, all of our pollution, for that matter, is being exported to China, all to places where there is no government standing up. And if you don't have trade agreements, if you don't begin, it's like multilateral conflict resolution on the military side. You need to set up a new order here. And until you can really guarantee that there's someone trying to build a middle class in those other places, you don't just throw everybody's fate to the wind like this with these trade agreements. Secondly, I agree with your autonomy points, and that is that all the fast tracking and all these institutions no one can watch or hold accountable making decisions in the dark is a bad thing, and that also needs to be fixed. There's one example. Let's have that debate. Let's just have that debate over how we really ought to be conducting global trade.
And on that note, We've run out of time, and we've been talking with Bill Curry, who writes a incisive political column for Salon every Sunday, for those of you who want to read it. He was a White House counselor of Bill Clinton, an elected state comptroller in Connecticut, where he pioneered the single option in health insurance, the public option, rather, in health insurance, and ran 2 times for governor of Connecticut. Thank you very much, Bill. To be continued. Keep sparking up the public debate.
Talk to you soon. Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, guys.
We've been talking to political analyst and columnist for Salon, Bill Curry, whose latest article is Hillary Clinton Just Doesn't Get It. She's already running a losing campaign. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, step up. Rise up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. If you want Ralph's weekly column emailed to you, go to nader.org and sign up. My name is David Feldman, along with Steve Scrovan, and of course, Ralph Nader. If you're just joining us on the radio and missed the incisive political analysis of our first guest, Salon columnist Bill Curry, subscribe to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast for free on iTunes or Stitcher, where you can not only hear this show, but catch up on all our old episodes. And it's a good idea to give us a good review on iTunes and Stitcher. Speaking of guests, our next one is a professor of radiology at Rutgers University in New Jersey, who 14 years ago was helping a young colleague with his research when she discovered that he was fabricating results. Repeated frustrating attempts to blow the whistle on this conduct has led her on an odyssey to reform the system that deals with research misconduct. Here to tell us all about this is Dr. Helene Z. Hill. Welcome, Dr. Hill.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming on, Dr. Hill. Scientific misconduct, of course, is quite widespread in different dimensions. You're going to be talking about fudging data and the types of cover-ups or cowardliness that has impeded clarification of this case that you spent so much time on. But in our work in consumer advocacy, we've seen another kind of scientific misconduct. We've seen the tobacco industry suppress data, fund research that was designed to come out the way they wanted it to come out, namely that nicotine didn't cause any illness for smokers. We have seen the drug companies who are supposed to only put in the marketplace drugs that are both safe and effective under the federal laws, put hundreds of prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs on the market. Our health research group put the exposés of these based on medical studies in 2 books, one called Pills That Don't Work and the other called Over-the-Counter Pills That Don't Work. They're fortunately now almost entirely removed from the marketplace because they were not effective for the purposes for which they were advertised, but they were promoted as if they were scientifically substantiated. So this is a really big problem. There is hardcore scientific fraud, fudging data, that was brought to the attention of the Congress, the lead industry covering up the asbestos industry, suppressing data or funding phony science, junk science. But your experience really went right to the core. We know that a lot of young researchers are ambitious. They're under a lot of pressure. They want grants, and sometimes they cross the line. So with that background, Dr. Hill, we have about 15 minutes to go over your thoughts. And what impressed me was not only your persistence over time, your challenge of the cover-up apparatus, but also the reforms that you have against misconduct. So let's start with some of the quick list of what you think would prevent scientific misconduct if these changes that you advocate were made. Can you just discuss those briefly?
Well, I don't know that you're ever going to be able to prevent it, but certainly we ought to be able to reduce it. And one of the things that is necessary is to train young scientists and let them know that it is not proper to fabricate data. And I think a lot of young people know this in their hearts, but that hasn't been emphasized to them, and they haven't been given training sessions to be sure that they know that they shouldn't do it. And they also need to know what the punishments are, and the punishments can be pretty dire. Although, unfortunately, when studies have been done to see what's happened to scientists who have been sanctioned by the Office of Research Integrity, a lot of them are still practicing science. Now, I suppose we have to forgive them for their past transgressions, but it also seems that it isn't fair because it's so competitive, and so people who have been fabricating data have gotten ahead of people who have been honest, and that's not right either.
Okay, so in terms of diminishing the presence of scientific misconduct, you know that scientists should make raw data publicly available, and that scientists should be obligated to report failed replication attempts to the journal that published the original results, because science has to be replicable. And you also say that all misconduct proceedings involving state and federally funded research should be open to the public, and that the final report of any review board should be public and should be available for examination. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, absolutely. I think that science should be as open as possible. Now, of course, there's always the problem of keeping things secret if there's any danger of releasing information that shouldn't be made public. But if information is available to everybody so that scientists can examine and go over other people's data, I think that's extremely important. I also think that the universities have a stake in getting the money. An individual scientist gets a grant, but the university gets about 35, 40, maybe 45% of the money that's put into that grant in order to pay for overhead and laboratory expenses and all that sort of thing. So the universities have a very big stake in all of this. And I think that when somebody is accused of committing scientific misconduct, the particular university where that occurs shouldn't be the one that sits in judgment of that person, because it's to their benefit to say that nothing was wrong. So I think that everything needs to be open, and also everything needs to be fair.
Not only that, but think of the stake that the public has. Because if this scientific misconduct finds its way in medical journals and public health journals, people can rely on it. Policymakers, consumers can rely on it. Take drugs that haven't been scientifically tested, just the opposite. They've been promoted based on data fraud. People can be harmed. People can die. Public policy can go in the wrong direction, say in controlling contaminants in the workplace. So this is not an arcane problem that Dr. Hill has been wrestling with over the years. Can you talk about your particular case, Dr. Hill, at the institution where you taught?
Right. Well, it all started when I observed this young postdoctoral fellow who I believed had made up results of an experiment, and I had been observing that experiment, and I didn't see anything. I didn't see any results on the dishes that he claimed he had results for. So I reported it to the university's committee for scientific integrity, and they examined and interviewed me and interviewed the boss of this young man, and also interviewed this young man, and they determined that there was not enough evidence. Well, I disagreed with them, and so I went to the Office of Research Integrity of the U.S. Public Health Service and made my report about what I believed was fabricated data. And actually, the woman who was processing my report, she agreed with me, and she thought that there had been data fabrication. And when she reported it to her superiors, they overruled her and decided to side with the university. I just couldn't go along with that because I just knew that something was not right. So I decided to file a case with the courts. It's called a qui tam. In the qui tam, I was what's known as a relator or a whistleblower, and the relator is representing the federal government, that the federal government has been defrauded. Well, it was a federal case because the fraud involved a grant application to the National Institutes of Health. So it was a federal grant that was being questioned here. Well, the case took 7 years, and I had to have expert witnesses. The expert witnesses were definitely on my side. They agreed that the science was not correct. And in fact, the numbers behind the results that this young man had produced just didn't stand up statistically. But unfortunately, statistics are not well understood, especially by the judiciary. So I lost the case in the lower court, and then we appealed. And the appeals court had 3 judges, and we had oral arguments. And the judge that introduced the case, she said, "We're just judges. I never had a science course in my life." So she really didn't understand what it was all about. So again, we lost in the appeals court. And so where do you go from there? Well, I went back to the university because by now I had had the benefit, actually. The case was very costly. I had to pay my lawyer, and it cost me about $200,000. But I figured it was worth it because in the course of exchanging information and so forth, I got all of the notebooks from the laboratory. I had PDF file scans of all of the experiments that had done in the laboratory over a period that started before this young man had been in the laboratory and ended several years after he had been there. So I had people who were not cheating at the same time that I could compare his data to the people that were cheating. I could compare the honest data to what I considered was the dishonest data. And I think that put me in a very unique position because I don't think that anyone has ever had the ability to analyze. It was actually 30,000 files that I went through. It took me rather a long time to go through them. But once I had been able to do that, I was able to make these comparisons. Unfortunately, statistics, which a lot of people don't understand, but the statistics came out very much against the results that this young man had produced.
Does that mean that his experiments could not be replicated?
I think he was sitting down and writing them, he was he was putting them on paper. He wasn't actually performing them. He had to go through the motions. It had to look like he was producing these results. He had to use up laboratory equipment and so forth, and I think he did all of that. I'm actually writing a book about this. It's called Hidden Data, and it should be coming out in the next 2 or 3 months. The subtitle is The Blind Eye of Science, because the data that were reported in 8 publications.
Publications.
8 publications, and also all of the data that he generated went into the grant application. And so there's a huge amount of data, and the statistics are way against him.
And all this false or fudge data is in all these journals that you mentioned. They haven't been retracted, and so presumably they're still misleading people?
That's right. That's right. And in fact, 2 of the papers have been very popular. There are places where you can go to find out how many other people have been citing articles that are written in scientific journals. And several hundred people have cited these 2 papers in particular. It's in a very popular field in radiation research. It's called the Bystander Effect, and it's an effect where cells that have been irradiated produce a substance that gets transferred to cells that have not been irradiated and then affects them, actually kills them. So it's a very important finding in radiation, and it was particularly relevant to nuclear medicine, which is where radioisotopes are used in diagnosis and also in treatment of cancer. And
what was the finding? What was the finding of this young man relating to the bystander effect?
The finding was that there was a bystander effect that was produced by radioisotopes. And as it turns out, I believe that his data were all fabricated. Now, it's not that there isn't a bystander effect. I think there is. But his experiments just didn't show it because he was making them up.
So in conclusion, Dr. Hill, could you tell us 2 things that really I'm curious about? What is this young man doing now? Was he rewarded? Has he got a tenured position? And second, how do we retract what you claim is false information, given the fact that these scientific journals are supposed to be run by people who are scientifically literate and are willing, as Alfred North Whitehead once said, to keep their options open for revision? That's one way he defined science.
Well, this young man is now a department chairman in a pharmacy school in Florida. And so he has been rewarded rather handsomely for his research. Now, I also, since he left the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey and moved on, he has written a number of research papers, and I have been able to analyze those. He's moved into a different field, but actually it's a little easier. As I told you, the data that I was looking at was statistically anomalous. Now what we're looking at are images, and they're images that have been modified. You can use a program that's available on your computer to analyze the images, and you can see where these images have been changed. And so it's quite easy to determine that this has happened. And I have looked at all the images in the papers that he has written since he left, and I find that there are a whole lot of image manipulation as well. So he's continued along the same path, I have to say.
Well, you know, in the write-up of your whistleblowing record by the magazine Scientist asked him to respond to your comments, and he declined to respond.
Well, yes, of course.
So how do we deal with what you claim to be the incorrect material that's floating around the world in these scientific journals?
Well, one way I'm countering that is that I'm writing a book about it. And I don't expect it's going to be a bestseller because it's not going to be understood by very many people. But I certainly hope to be able to use the book to show people the extensiveness of the alleged fraud. So that will be my next weapon, I think, is that book.
Dr. Hill, thank you very much for your participation here, and thank you for your heroic work at persisting in exposing scientific misconduct. We're looking forward to your new book. Could you tell listeners how they could reach you, your contact information?
They can reach me. I have email, and that is hzhill@verizon.net. And I have a website, and the whole story is on the website. And the website is www.helenezhill.com. So that's HELENEZHILL.com. No punctuation in my name.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill, for being here.
Oh, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hill.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
We've been talking to Dr. Helene Z. Hill of Rutgers University. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, step up. Rise up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. David, tell us about what Ralph's going to be doing in a few weeks.
Well, here's an opportunity to actually get to hang out with Ralph Nader May 15th through May 17th at the Rowe Camp and Conference Center in Rowe, Massachusetts, 413-339-4954, rowecenter.org, ROWE center.org. May 15th through the 17th, you can be in the woods with Ralph Nader, getting
Ralph,
it done.
are you actually going to be in the woods? Are you going to be camping, Ralph?
No, it's actually a center on how to strengthen our democracy and get things done. So it's a very intensive seminar. I did it last year. People loved it. And it's a beautiful part of New England in the spring. And you can get more details on the website that David has just given you.
That's rowecenter.org. And it sounds like a great weekend. And are you going to treat people to your bird calls, or is that not? Anyway,
David,
You might say the food is very good.
that's all that matters, by the way. Now, also, people should like Ralph Nader's Facebook page, because if you like Ralph Nader's Facebook page, you can ask questions, and many of those questions will be asked on the air. For example, Steve, you have a question.
Yes, I don't have a question, but Brad Cecil does. And he is asking Ralph, what will be the most effective way to roll back from Citizens United? Citizens United, as you know, is the Supreme Court decision about campaign finance and being able to give unlimited funds to PACs. So what would you say to that, Ralph?
Well, there are several effective ways. The question is, what's their likelihood? The most effective way is to have a different composition of the Supreme Court so they reverse in a future decision, Citizens United. Another way would be to beat the drums for a constitutional amendment, which several groups are beginning to do, contacting state legislatures. About 15 of them have already issued resolutions opposing Citizens United. You can get more details on that by going to citizen.org, because Public Citizen, a group I founded many years ago, is one of the leaders in overturning Citizens United. Another way that's more practical, perhaps, if we had a little better Congress, is simply to have Congress put an amendment on some budget bill that says any company that does business with the federal government, and that's all the big companies, they all do business with the federal government, cannot take advantage of Citizens United and give endless money against or for candidates for public office through these secret super PACs and other mechanisms that are opening the gusher of immense corporate money contaminating our electoral process. And that's the easiest way to do it, because I don't know a single sizable company that doesn't have contracts or doesn't get grants or doesn't get leaseholds from the federal government.
Is that the same as disclosure, Ralph, or is that a different issue?
There was a separate disclosure bill filed by some Democrats right after Citizens United was issued in 2010, simply to say, okay, if the companies are going to give this money, they've got to disclose it. And that was too much for the Republicans, who blocked it. But I think the procurement way, in my judgment, is really the easiest, in the sense that it invokes a left-right coalition. You know, if you're going to make profit by dealing with federal contracts and grants, you shouldn't be able to send money to influence the process to members of Congress or to the White House. That's the point I tried to make in my recent book, Unstoppable, the Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State.
Well, Ralph, have any of these groups you've talked about who are spearheading these efforts, have they taken you up on this?
I haven't had anybody take up the amendment. I think that's the best way to go. I learned about this because we were involved in Southern California effort years ago and got through ordinances in 4 or 5 cities in California saying, if you do business with the city, you can't make political contributions. Santa Monica, for example, was one of them. I just think this is the best way to go.
Well, very good. Thank you, Brad Cecil, for that question. David?
We have a question from Tammy Letts. She asks, can Ralph Nader focus on treaty rights of Native Americans regarding KXL and Fort Laramie treaties of 1851 and 1868, Onondaga lawsuits against New York State and Allied Chemical, and his thoughts about Justice Ginsburg's bizarre claim that the treaty signed by President Washington is too old to honor, as well as the injustices endured by Leonard Peltier?
Well, that's a big question with a lot of parts. Now, I wrote my first article on the plight of First Native Americans for the Harvard Law Record in 1956 after traveling through a number of the reservations. And people should know that there are scores of treaties that are still on the books between the U.S. government and Indian tribes, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Blackfoot tribe, the Crow tribe, and many others. And almost to the T, there have been violations by the U.S. government over the decades of these treaties at one level or another. And these treaties recognize a certain level of sovereignty to the Indian reservations, as they were called. They're not as sovereign as, say, a foreign country is, but they are sovereign in the sense that the tribes have their own courts, they have their own Indian law, they have their own jurisdiction, they have their own boundaries that they can control up to a limit. And given that background, Tammy Letts' question is, do these treaties still hold when tribes are trying to invoke them and they're 100, 150, 200 years old? And the answer is they do hold, that the courts have largely upheld them. They often have misinterpreted their terms and ruled against the tribes, but no one has said decisively in a court of law that they're obsolete and they're no longer operative. Now, I think the comment by Justice Ginsburg was just a side comment. It didn't have the force of judicial opinion, and I don't really know why she said that, because I don't know the background of it. As far as Leonard Peltier is concerned, this is a case where he is in prison for life, and the supporters of his case say that in the shootout that led to his conviction, the evidence was not properly tried in the court of law that ended up in his sentence. And so there's basically a worldwide support structure, as there's been for some celebrated defendants in our country, saying that he deserves a new trial.
Very good. Thank you for that question, Tammy Letts. This is a question from Jerry Anderson, who asks, why is our government doing nothing about Fukushima? And what can the people of this country do about that?
Very perceptive. Some may say, what do you mean? What are we supposed to do about a Japanese nuclear disaster involving several plants next to each other that evacuated huge areas, contaminated the Japanese residents, spilled into the Pacific, contaminated land and food, and still has evacuation zones that are uninhabited? The answer to that question is that radioactivity doesn't recognize national borders. It migrates, and there is evidence of radioactivity from the Fukushima disaster and its tsunami, the earthquake, have reached the shores of the western states in the United States. There have been tests that show that is the case. And so there's got to be an international treaty, and the United States should take the lead, basically saying that nuclear power is not just a matter for where the plant is in XYZ countries. It's a matter for international control, because as a disaster at Chernobyl in Ukraine demonstrated with the release of radioactivity, it was detected in significant levels over a dozen countries. The food products in Wales and England were contaminated. Reindeer in Finland were contaminated. Materials in Turkey were contaminated. And there is no international treaty. And there has to be, because with the hundreds of nuclear plants and earthquakes and tsunamis and human error and technological defects and all the rest of it, it's only a matter of time before there are more containment breaches of these nuclear plants and the release of enormous amounts of radioactivity. I mean, one 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant has hundreds of times of more radioactivity than the fallout from the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. And as for what the people of this country can do about it, contact some of the valiant citizen groups that are in great agreement with your concern. Union of Concerned Scientists is one of them. You can look it up. Another one is the Critical Mass Energy arm of Public Citizen. Go to citizen.org. And there are several other anti-nuclear groups, including one called beyondnuclear.org.
And there's also Friends of the Earth.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you for those Facebook questions. Keep them coming on Ralph's Facebook page, and we'll try to work our way through them. My name is Steve Scrove. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, I want to thank our guests Bill Curry and Helene Z. Hill. You've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Join us again next week.
Thank you very much, David and Steve. Thank your listeners. I hope you'll spread the word, get more radio stations listening to this program, and generate more civic action.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple, just make a list of demands. We demand freedom, we demand equality.